On day 3, we woke up early and energized, and ready to get to work. Today, we would be meeting with Katherine Meier, a primate dietary ecologist at Yale University. She lived just a few miles away from where we were staying, and she offered to pick us up and bring us to a local farmer's market where we could see a whole bunch of dogs and get a really healthy breakfast. We started wondering, was today our first day of work or our first day off? But almost immediately after getting into Katherine's car, we got an email from Dr. Gary Aronsen. He's a biological anthropologist at the Yale Peabody Museum, and he'd also be able to meet with us. So it seemed our laid-back day of steering wheel-sized cinnamon buns and sitting in a nice, quiet basement, geeking out over orangutans and gibbons, was about to get a lot busier.
My name is Katherine Meier, and I am a first-year PhD student here at Yale University. I'm in the combined Anthropology and School of Forestry degree program, PhD program, and I am going to be studying chimpanzee ecology and conservation. The great apes are what most people know about, and that's humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. So orangutans are what I spent a year studying in Indonesia, and chimpanzees and gorillas are the African apes, which I will now study here for my PhD. If you go to a zoo and you watch any of the great apes for any amount of time, you just immediately see how closely related they are to humans just through their behavior, the complexity of their behavior, and the obvious cognitive abilities that they possess. Orangutans are awesome. Everyone knows them as those big orange apes, but a lot of people don't realize that chimpanzees and gorillas live across Central Africa, but orangutans only are found on the islands of Borneo and Sumatra. So they are really restricted to a tiny area of the world, and across the tropics, forests are being lost really rapidly. But in Indonesia and that area of the world, Borneo and Sumatra, it's happening at an exponential rate.
Katherine talked a lot about the real-time effects of deforestation and habitat loss, and the impacts that has on wildlife. Gary, on the other hand, talked about the role of museums in engaging everyday people and the importance of education in connecting people with the natural world, and also the surprising role that seemingly lifeless museum collections play in modern-day scientific research.
So my name is Gary Aronsen, and I'm the director of the Yale Biological Anthropology Laboratories here at Yale University, and I'm also a curatorial affiliate here at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. It's important to recognize that museums in general have incredible value, both for studies of the past to understand where these animals may have come from, or to try and look at aspects of evolutionary biology, but also for the future. So with several students here at the university, I've been working through the majority of the primate skeletal collection at the museum in order to look at each individual animal, both because it tells us a little bit about each individual's personal life history, disease, trauma, social ecology, and behavior, but also because in the 21st century, since so many primates are in danger, some of the aspects of their dietary ecology, some aspects of their range, even localities that might be present on some of the animals that we have in this institution. Some of these places no longer have living primates in them, but we are able to look at things like dental enamel, to look at the kinds of isotopes that are present, about the kinds of foods or the kinds of things they may have eaten, that those forests no longer exist or are no longer present. So in looking at very recent carcasses from animals that may have been captured from hunting or been confiscated by smugglers and things like that, looking at things like dental enamel isotopes in a 21st century animal versus one of these possibly 19th century animals can really tell you a lot about how much the habitat has changed or what kind of dietary flexibility you can see in different primates.
It was a lot to take in, and we had a lot to process. This trip was speeding up, and things weren't about to get less hectic. So I took advantage of the fact that we were staying with 2 avid cyclists, and I woke up extra early the next day to use some of their tools and generally give the bikes a once-over. It's the morning of Sunday, I think the 28th. We are about to leave Dan and Emily's. And I'm just going over all the bikes, making sure the brakes are good, chains are clean, tires are inflated, and generally that nothing is going to explode as soon as we start pedaling. I think we might beat the rain today. It's super clear out. Like, can you see it? Yeah, you can see it. It's like a little bit cloudy, but super blue. I don't know. That'd be awesome. Well, we definitely didn't beat the rain again. It wasn't super cold. It wasn't a really hard rain. And we didn't have a really long ride. So it wasn't as bad as our way to Camden and New Haven, even though our ride to Camden and New Haven was probably our most enjoyable day, despite the intense downpours. This ride was different, though. We started in Camden, which is right next door to New Haven, and we moved through New Haven and rode through the Yale University campus. We made our way into West Haven, and we started noticing the areas start to change. We went down along the water, and we started seeing more and more of the differences in socioeconomic status when you leave somewhere like New Haven with an Ivy League university. And you head down through so many other areas that, while wonderful communities, they clearly don't have the same kind of median income. And with the backdrop of this project, we started thinking about it in a different way. So much of the onus of animal conservation is placed onto the individual. What can individuals do when faced with the choice of prioritizing feeding their family and animal conservation? So as we passed through all the different areas that we saw, past boarded up houses and communities with such high income demographics that we actually passed someone's house with a sign on their property that said, "Private sanctuary, no hunting." So this is one person's house, letting you know that their property is so large that you may mistake it for a wilderness area where hunting is permitted. So these are the types of things that were going through our minds and the things that we were talking about as we made our way to the Beardsley Zoo.
Well, my name is Lindsay Carubia, and I am an animal care specialist here at Beardsley Zoo. I've been here for about 15 years. I started out as an intern, and then I was a seasonal employee for a while, and I've been full-time for the last 14 and a half years. As any zoo that's part of AZA is, we have sort of a twofold mission. One is education, and then the other side of it is conservation. So we work hard to educate everyone that comes through our doors, especially the kids. You know, we obviously have lots of signage up and all that sort of stuff. We have several different groups of volunteers that educate the public at the exhibits to try to, you know, teach kids about not only the animals but the environment and the role that they can play. And that ties into the conservation side of things. So we work not only financially to help other conservation organizations, but we also support breeding programs to keep a lot of these really at-risk species healthy and happy in captivity with nice genetic populations, so that hopefully in the future we can work on more release programs, you know, into these areas that hopefully we will be able to conserve better in the future.
Captive breeding is determined by the SSP, which is the Species Survival Program. So they determine what species are allowed to breed based on genetics throughout all of the captive populations. So every year or 2 years, depending on what animal, we'll get recommendations, and then that determines which pairs we're allowed to breed. So for instance, our gibbons right now, they do not have a breeding recommendation. So we won't be breeding them for the next 2 years, unfortunately. But in the rainforest, we do have recommendations for our howler monkeys, stocky monkeys, and we do currently have 2 infants in there, so that's been pretty exciting. But basically here at the park we have North America region, Africa, Australasia, and the rainforest. So each of those regions, they have their, you know, different animals and different recommendations based on whatever animals they have in particular. So.
We spoke a lot with Lindsay at the Beardsley Zoo, as well as Kelly at the Roger Williams Park Zoo, before we even left Providence, about the different ways that zoos work to educate individuals and also work with regional governments on behalf. And it started dawning on me the kind of parallels that this particular project has with my own observations as a commuter cyclist. And just thinking back to earlier, when we were making our way through the different kinds of areas and looking at the different kinds of buildings and the different kinds of houses, the different kinds of establishments, and the sizes of people's property, whether or not they even own property, whether or not the majority of the property in their neighborhoods was even occupied. And I couldn't help but relate that to the people in these rural communities in undeveloped or developing nations. How much can anybody care about conservation when they're struggling to feed their families? Whether you're in an inner city food desert and maybe they're getting some of, their vegetable staples canned and maybe in a dollar store. The notion of animal conservation probably doesn't even cross your mind very often. It's not that you don't care about animals, it's just that no part of your income can be allocated to that. You want yourself and your family, your children, to have enough to eat and to have it be as nutritious as possible. You want to be able to get to work. You want to be able to get your children to school. Similarly, in remote areas, if you have the choice to clear cut a forest and feed your family, or not clear cut a forest and continue to go hungry, what do you do there? What do you do when you desperately need an income? You don't have the choice to prioritize conservation. And there aren't a lot of people who can individually make that choice to donate a significant enough portion of money to one of these causes. Yet, so much is placed on the choices that everyday people make. And so a lot of what we talked about with Lindsay and with Kelly and with Katherine was the sort of shift of that balance and the way that governmental or corporate entities can just sort of tweak things just a bit and make it so that conservation, whether individual animals or the overall environment, maybe it's not necessarily the focal point, but it's a big enough part of the byproduct to where the impact individuals are having are real, immediate, and tangible. And they don't set back the lives of the people in the communities where they're implemented.
And one of the programs that we've participated in over the years is the Golden Lion Tamarin, or GLT SSP program. And we worked with organizations in Brazil that were able to conserve some areas of forest where these animals were living. They actually relocated some of the wild animals into these protected areas. And then they reached out to captive populations looking for animals to release into these wild protected areas. So we were part of the breeding program. We had some babies that were sent to the wild, and this program was active from like the mid-'80s through 2000. It's been a really great program. They've continued it since the release happened to sort of extend to trying to connect these pockets of rainforest that are left, because they're pretty much full of monkeys. You can't fit any more monkeys in these little pockets. And then long term you end up with potential genetic issues because these animals start to get inbred after generations. So they're working with the government to connect land bridges over highways, to connect different pockets of forest where they've sort of gone through with the giant road. And they've also worked closely with a lot of farmers to say, hey, we have these volunteers and these trees, and we would love to plant this, band of trees between this side of your property and that side of your property. And it's basically enough room for their cattle or whatever animals that they may have to walk through the trees, but the monkeys can still kind of use it as a highway to get from one pocket to another, and so that those groups of animals can have some genetic exchange. So it's been really cool. Brazil has really been supportive They made sort of the GLT kind of their national animal. So it's really helped to encourage this movement locally for them, so that they've had a lot more success with the locals there and with the government in terms of sort of making this happen. So it's been really amazing. It's really awesome that so many people from like all different parts of the world have come together to like save this animal. I mean, really, they were in very dire straits, and the numbers, I mean, they're still clearly threatened, but the numbers have, really expanded since when they first initiated this program. And it's pretty cool to know that animals that were born here, like out in the wild, and their babies are out in the wild, like where they're supposed to be, It's awesome.
But that governmental outreach only works when the government follows through. And as we've seen time and time again throughout history, governments don't always like to follow through. They're often more opportunistic than benevolent.
The Indonesian president had just signed a moratorium on new palm oil licenses. So it was looking really good that he was like supporting these efforts and trying to minimize deforestation from palm oil production. But they just had a new presidential election, and in the heat of trying to be reelected, he completely reneged on that moratorium, and he's threatening to he was threatening to remove Indonesia from the Paris Climate Accord. All these crazy things that would just really completely undo what he had done, and then just exponentially increase the amount of palm oil production that is happening in that area of the world.
Political opportunism aside, people can be hesitant to change, especially when they feel like that change can impact their livelihood or the social fabric that they've known their entire lives. It's a narrow path, and it's definitely not one that's easily navigated. But the fact of the matter is, these are delicate ecosystems that are slow to recover.
Tropical peat swamp forests are actually really, really unique habitats, and peat swamps form when layers of sediment kind of build up in unique areas where they don't decompose, and so it builds up this thick layer of peat and this happens over thousands and thousands of years. And then the forest grows on top of it, and obviously it's a whole different kind of forest, tropical forest, than you would than a highland or a lowland dry forest or other kinds of rainforest. So the site that I was working at, actually these swamp forests harbor some of the highest densities of orangutans that we know of in Borneo and even within Indonesia. And so they are these refuges for a lot of different species, including orangutan populations. And most people don't really want to develop a swamp for human habitation, heavily, but they are really heavily at risk from palm oil development, palm oil is a cash crop that's grown primarily in Malaysia and Indonesia. Those two places produce 85% of the world's palm oil, and palm oil is used across the world, so there's a high demand for it, and it's being produced in such a small area of the world, which happens to be concurrent with the range of orangutans. So orangutan populations have pretty much declined in parallel to losses in forest habitat, so really quickly. And just in 2016, which is the year before we left for Indonesia, orangutans were upgraded from just endangered to critically endangered on the IUCN Red List.
But environments do change, whether naturally or through anthropogenic means. But thanks to research done by groups like Dr. Aronsen and his team, we're able to take a look at animals that lived long ago and examine them in new ways, to take a look at what their lives were like when they lived, what their environment was like, what their diet was like. And we're able to get a better understanding of the environments that they lived in, both long before we started keeping track, as well as long before we had the kind of impact on them that we do today.